Robert Jenrick is on a mission to win over party members. So what's he up to today?
Well, his latest offering is a plan to give child grooming gangs full life sentences.
OK. Well, we're joined now by our reporter, Charlie Peters, before we speak to Robert Jenrick about this grooming situation. Where, first of all, Charlie, does it happen around the country?
Well, we found over 50 different towns and cities in a 50 in a GB News investigation last year, which produced part of an investigative documentary, which found widespread ongoing abuse with this scandal. But when I think most people think about it, they think about Rotherham, Rochdale and Telford. Those are the three areas where there have been those big public inquiries, local inquiries into the situation. They found thousands of children have been victims to these gangs. Now, there has been some intervention by government over the years. Last year, Suella Braverman, the then Home Secretary, launched a grooming gangs crackdown, which introduced a National Crime Agency-led task force. It made over 500 arrests in its first year, trained over 400 new officers in data awareness and analysis, which was a crucial part of the failures in previous decades in tackling this crisis. But there are still more steps to be taken. Even parts of that announcement that Suella Braverman made at the time weren't followed through by the last government. So it's an ongoing crisis and there's still steps to be taken.
Charlie, just I want to be a bit more specific about things because people often avoid the whole issue here. 50 locations around the country you're talking about. We're talking about, let's face it, we're talking about grooming gangs, we're talking about paedophiles here, right? Paedophiles. And are these paedophiles mainly Asian?
So I think we've found an overrepresentation of Pakistani men within child sex grooming gangs and an overrepresentation of white girls among their victims. They're not all of their victims. There is a cross-sectarian mix of the sort of boys and mostly girls that they have targeted over the years. But that's been the cultural split, and that's generated over the years many situations where both leaders in local authorities, police officers and politicians alike have wanted to avoid talking about this issue because they are nervous about being called racist or dealing with that problem.
One man who wants to talk about it, Robert Jenrick, joins us on the programme this morning. Very good to see you.
Good morning.
And, you know, you're not leader of the Conservative Party, you're not in government, so... But if you were, what do you plan to do about this?
Well, firstly, can I pay tribute to Charlie, who has been exceptional. Very few journalists have had the courage and tenacity to take up this issue, and he's done a great public service in doing so. But the public want action now. They are sick of this. This is a moral stain on our country, that thousands of children have been abused in this way, and public officials have turned a blind eye to it.
I'll tell you something. You're right. News can be distant. If it doesn't affect our lives, it doesn't relate to us. And in the past few years, I have interviewed and I then personally met someone who was groomed by one of these Asian gangs. And people in their vicinity, in their neighbourhood, knew that this went on. And this has affected these women throughout their lives, and it will never, ever go away. But people housed, knew, were related to, were married to these men, and they knew what they were doing, and a blind eye was turned to it all. And it's sickening, absolutely sickening, to hear someone recount one of these stories. And no one in the past seemed to be doing anything about it.
Look, I agree with you. I'm a parent of 3 young children. I can only begin to imagine what it's like to have your children go through an experience like this. What we need is action now to try to eliminate this, because only a fool would believe this isn't happening today on our streets somewhere in our country. What I want to see are mandatory life sentences for these despicable predators, so that you're not out in 14 years, as the current law suggests, or less, but actually you're never out of prison again. I want those of these predators who are not British citizens to be removed from our country with compulsory deportations. And the public officials who turn a blind eye for fear of racism or community relations, I want them to be prosecuted and barred from working in the public sector ever again. Because we can't just allow this moral stain to continue.
But it's not just public officials, it's police, it's the judiciary, frankly, and it is very much politicians who are too darn scared to stand up in Parliament, even where they're protected, frankly, and speak it like it really should be. Actually, you know, confront the fact that there is a racial element here, when in fact it's probably more than an element, isn't it?
And I think people
and actually
within these
face it head on.
people within these communities are aware of this, and an awful lot of them want something done about it.
So would you be, for instance, brave enough to stand up and speak it like it is?
Well, I'm on your programme talking about it today, and you're absolutely right. There are people in local councils, in the police, in the judiciary, in the community who have turned a blind eye to this, as the Alexis J report says, because they were fearful of being labelled as racist.
But they're not just turning a blind eye, they're negligent. In fact, you could even say they're enabling it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's why I say they should be prosecuted. This isn't a minor thing, is it? These are children's lives that are being wrecked by vile, disgusting predators. Yeah. So they should be prosecuted, and they should be barred from ever working in these positions again.
Robert, I just want to hear from Charlie as to how widespread. He talked about 50 towns, which I wasn't aware, because I thought, again, this was Yorkshire, Lancashire.
And Bristol, Oxford, Newcastle, Aylesbury, all over the country where you find this sort of abuse, you find similar patterns. The fact that that isn't known, Eamon, for example, I think is part of why this is so concerning to so many people, because there's never really been a national look at this problem. We had that nationwide task force launched last year, as I mentioned earlier, which has led to so many arrests. But why has it taken until 2023 for that to happen? Why is it taking until now for more politicians to make these comments? We've known about this scandal in some part for well over a decade, in some communities for far longer.
Why is he so different? Does he stand out as regards politicians and actually calling for these sort of sentences and for this to be criminalised the way he's saying?
Well, the question I have for Robert is some of the powers and the policy demands you're making now, those are powers you had in the last government, the Nationality and Borders Act, powers to apply visa penalties to countries that refuse to accept deported grooming gang abusers. You had those powers when you were Immigration Minister. Did you want to apply them to, say, Pakistani men who had their British nationality stripped but who Pakistan wouldn't accept to be deported? Did you not use that power? Did you know about it? Did you want to use it?
Yes, well, I worked with Suella Braverman, who actually I think was excellent on this issue. She created the Grooming Gangs Task Force, which led to over 500 arrests, and we did seek to use the powers that you're referring to. I don't think that is quite enough. Those powers are not strong enough, and at the end of the day, ultimately depends on will within government. If the Foreign Office don't want to apply visa sanctions, then the Home Office won't be able to pursue them. I started to deport people who were doing a range of things as Immigration Minister, like anti-Semites, for example, on our streets. And this was considered a very controversial thing to do. Previously, the Home Office only removed the visas from a tiny number of people, like the most extreme hate preachers, for example. But my view is a visa is not a right, is it? It's a privilege.
Yeah.
If you spend time,
which should be withdrawn.
If you spend time in our country and you do something like participate in a grooming gang, you're an evil predator of our children, or indeed you're on the streets of London espousing anti-British sentiment, you should be out.
But Robert, I think people should know really what's involved about this, and so often people like us haven't talked about the detail of this before, but when I learned that these men groom these children from 8 and 9 and 10 years of age, and they do it with sweeties and lemonade
and pizzas,
drugs,
and takeaways.
Drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, so then it grows.
So last month I was at Sheffield Crown Court for the sentencing of 7 men for 106 years. One of the survivors from that case gave a victim impact statement. She was aged 11 when she was groomed at her primary school playground, plied with alcohol and drugs and abused soon after. We're revealing today on the channel that one of those men sentenced for that crime for 14 years, Mohammed Amar, he is now appealing his sentence. Now, Robert, you're calling for these whole life tariffs for grooming gang abusers. One of the announcements that Suella Braverman made last year in that crackdown was an aggravating statutory offence for grooming gang abusers. That never went through because the election was called. Some voters may be concerned and say, how can we trust a Conservative again to bring in these stronger sentences when you told victims you'd do it last year, but it wasn't included in the wash-up? What do you say to that?
Well, I want to see that happen. I mean, you're absolutely right that the current sentences are pathetic. How can you be a predator and get a maximum tariff of 14 years and be out in less than
Well, you're
that?
saying it should be life.
I think it should be a whole life sentence.
I mean, here you are talking about this, which is very welcome, but you are, even if you get the leadership, you are in opposition. So you're not going to be able to bring in some of these policies, for instance, until you win another election, if indeed you're around when that happens. So, I mean, how can you try and keep the present government online as an effective opposition on this subject?
Well, part of my argument is that powerful people have failed in their duty to raise these issues. So even in opposition, I think there is an important task for us to do as the Conservative Party to raise this. Why is this not being discussed more in Parliament? This is a national stain on our country. You know, the other day, Keir Starmer spoke rightly of a range of national scandals, like the Grenfell tragedy, like Hillsborough, but he didn't talk about the grooming gangs, and he's not alone in that. Yeah. So few politicians raise this up as one of the principal, most shocking scandals.
And that is prison places. There are none. So, I mean, who's going to seriously listen to you talking about life-term sentences?
Well, I've been very clear. I want to build more prisons, firstly, and if I was lucky enough to lead this party and ultimately to be Prime Minister, that would be a big priority for me.
Yeah, but that's 5 years hence.
And that's time down the road. You're right to say that. I want to get the 10,000 foreign national offenders who are in our prisons out of our country. That is the principal way of freeing up more places, and that's one of the reasons I say, well, let's not mess around. Let's deport people who are in our country who are not.
Human rights not interfere with all of that.
It certainly does. It certainly does. If you're a vile sexual predator, but have a family in the UK, we won't be able to remove them.
Well, that's it. Martin has been in touch straight away. Said a lot of these Pakistani men involved in grooming gangs are married with children here. Does Jenrick honestly think that the Liberal judiciary would allow them to be deported?
Well, this is the reason why I make the argument time and again that we need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. Because when Winston Churchill signed up to that and said there should be a right to family life, he didn't mean that a vile sexual predator from a foreign country should have their deportation refused because they happen to have a wife or a child here in the United Kingdom. That's obviously shameful, and we need to change that. I'm hopeful that I can persuade the Conservative Party members in this leadership contest of that argument, and we can move forward with our party's policy, at least, to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. You can't move forward with
policy as opposition. All you can do is be a really good opposition.
Well, you can create awareness.
Yes.
And these people understand that what they do is not tolerated. It's not acceptable within their communities and whatever. I think, you know, at the very least, that would happen.
Yes, and you can hold the government's feet to the fire on
We can hold the government's feet to the fire, and we can give a voice to these voiceless children and communities, because that has not happened. You know, I grew up near Telford, for example, a place where I think over 1,000 children, at least, were abused in this way. You know, most people in that area in Shropshire are probably completely oblivious to what were happening. So we need to change that, don't we? We need the whole country to understand this is happening, you know, under their noses. We've got to change it.
Robert Jenrick, thank you for telling us your plans. If you have got to say, like our viewers in this,
yes, Martin,
been in touch like Martin today, please do have your say. Let us know. For the moment, thank you.
Thank you very much.